Welcome to my channel.
PC Hamish Macbeth sat at the window of the Lochdu Hotel, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and watching the December rain streak the glass in slow, mournful lines. The wind whipped through the village like it had a personal grievance against everything upright, and Hamish, in the cosiest sense of defiance, decided it was a perfectly good excuse to do nothing. Towser, his loyal and suspiciously intelligent sheepdog, lay stretched on the rug, snoring in time with the patter of the rain. Hamish contemplated the salmon he hadn't yet poached in the river below. He had all morning, really. Nobody in Lochdu was in any hurry, and that suited him just fine. "Ah, there's nae hurry in the world that can't wait till tomorrow," he muttered, though secretly he enjoyed the thrill of the chase, whether it was fish or something far more complicated. Of course, the morning's peace was not destined to last. Through the fog and drizzle, a shiny car, far too sleek, far too loud, far too English, rolled up the village's single cobbled street. It parked with a confidence that suggested the owner believed Lochdu existed merely for their amusement. The newcomer stepped out, tall, expensive, and scented like a department store. He wore a fur-trimmed coat that glistened even under the dreary sky, and carried a small, perfectly polished leather briefcase. "Must be another Sassenach," Hamish muttered, mostly to himself, as the man surveyed the village with a look that combined mild disgust and the certainty of someone who had never had to queue for anything in their life. The hotel bell jingled as the newcomer pushed the door open. "Is this Lochdu?" he asked, in the kind of clipped tone that suggested he didn't really expect an answer. "It is indeed, sir," said Mrs. Biggers, the hotel proprietor, smiling tightly as she balanced a tray of mince pies. "Though I'm afraid it's rarely as lively as Edinburgh or London." "Lively?" the man sniffed. "I hardly think a place like this." He paused, looked at Towser, who regarded him with the patience of a saint, "has much to offer. I'll be needing accommodations, the finest you have." Hamish sipped his coffee and tried not to snort. The finest in Lochdu usually meant a duvet that smelled faintly of mothballs and a radiator that creaked like it had been born in the Victorian era. Towser's ears twitched. Hamish knew the dog shared his suspicions. "Best let him get comfy," he murmured. "He'll be tripping over the weather soon enough." But as always, fate, or some mischievous Highland spirit, had other plans. Hamish's phone buzzed with the insistent insistence that he might have to do something serious today. He ignored it. After all, nothing could ruin a perfect cup of coffee quite like work. Still, there was a small, nagging part of him that knew. The arrival of this Sassenach, with his sharp shoes and sharper manners, was going to stir things up. And in Lochdu, disturbance rarely came without consequences. For now, though, Hamish leaned back, eyes half closed, coffee at hand, Towser at his feet, and thought contentedly that a man could at least pretend a little longer that the world could leave him in peace. Hamish barely stirred when the hotel door opened again, but Towser's low growl alerted him that the newcomer had returned from some aimless perambulation through the mist. The Englishman carried himself with the same air of impatient superiority, his polished shoes leaving faint, damp imprints on the old wooden floor. He glanced around the lobby, as if expecting the place to collapse under the weight of its rustic charm, and then, with a grim set to his jaw, he muttered, "This village, it's quaint, yes. Quaint and inefficient." Hamish, who had only half listened while contemplating whether a second cup of coffee was warranted, noted the stranger's irritation with a faintly amused frown. There was a certain rhythm to people like this, high opinion of themselves, low patience for reality. He'd seen many Sassenachs in Lochdu before, all of them equally predictable. Some left after a week, grumbling, others stayed and brought chaos. He suspected this one might be the latter. Towser shifted closer to the stranger, sniffing with professional suspicion. Hamish made a vague motion to calm him. "He'll figure it out soon enough," he murmured. "Just give him a chance to discover that Highland life isn't made for schedules." As the morning stretched on, the rain turned to a drizzle, and the mist lifted just enough to reveal the river where Hamish had been meaning to cast his line. He imagined the salmon slipping through his fingers in protest at his delay, and for a brief moment considered leaving the hotel, grabbing his rod and disappearing into the reeds. Yet something told him that the peace would not hold. Loch Dhu, after all, had a way of reminding one that quiet afternoons were often the precursor to chaos. It was Mrs. Biggers who delivered the first clear indication of impending disruption. She bustled past, balancing a tray with a polite tremor in her hands. "Hamish, you'll want to see this," she said, voice tight with excitement or anxiety. He couldn't tell which. Mr. Cavendish," she hesitated, glancing toward the newcomer. But before she could finish, a shriek cut through the mild din of the hotel, high and sharp, reverberating down the hallways and out into the street. Towser leapt upright, fur bristling, and Hamish dropped his spoon, sending the last dregs of coffee sloshing. He had never been fond of shrieks. They always meant trouble, and sometimes trouble that moved faster than one could sip a cup of warmth. Hamish and Towser were out the door in a moment, splashing through puddles, the wind tugging at his coat and hat, as if eager to whisk him toward whatever disaster had emerged. Across the street, near the village green, a small crowd had already begun to form, eyes wide, mouths open, and umbrellas forming a shaky black sea above them. In the centre of it all lay Mr. Cavendish, in a posture so improbable that Hamish's first thought was that someone had tripped him for the sake of a joke. But the expression on his face made it clear this was no comedy. He knelt beside the body, Towser circling cautiously. The man's coat was damp, and his hair plastered to his head by the persistent drizzle. One shoe had come off and lay a few feet away, ridiculous in its pristine English shine. His hands were twisted in odd angles, and a thin smear of blood marked his temple. Hamish straightened, brow furrowed, and let out a low whistle. "Well," he murmured to no one in particular, "this does complicate the day." The crowd murmured anxiously, some stepping back, others craning to see. Among them, Hamish noticed familiar faces, Mrs. MacLeod clutching her shawl, the postmistress peering over her spectacles, and young Angus, whose job seemed to be turning up at every disaster in the village. They looked at him expectantly, for in Loch Dhu it was understood that if there was trouble, Hamish Macbeth would notice it. Sometimes lazily, sometimes with extraordinary attention, but always noticing. The newcomer's situation was clear enough. He had met a violent, abrupt end, and though the village's police station was just around the corner, Hamish knew he would be called to explain, calm, and observe. It was the quiet detective work, the watching and listening while everyone else flailed, that he excelled at. By the time DCI Blair's car screeched into the village, a large, shiny machine that seemed almost offended by Loch Dhu's narrow streets, Hamish had already moved into observation mode. Blair jumped from the car with all the subtlety of a storm cloud and immediately began barking orders, red-faced and drenched by the Highland drizzle. "Move back," he shouted at the villagers. "PC Macbeth, stand aside." Hamish lifted one eyebrow and did nothing but step to the side, arms crossed, letting Blair's theatrical entrance unfold. The villagers flinched under Blair's voice, and Towser growled softly, as if warning the chief inspector that not all of Loch Dhu's secrets were meant to be shouted at. Blair knelt beside the body, poking and prodding with an ungloved hand. "Bloody fool," he muttered, though directed at whom was unclear. "It's obvious this man was—" He paused, scanning the crowd for someone to accuse, and settled on young Angus, who shrank under the gaze. Did you see anything? Speak," Angus stammered, and Hamish could hear the inner panic rising in the boy, the desperation of someone suddenly caught between awe and terror. Blair, oblivious to nuance, seemed satisfied that he had found his first suspect. Hamish, however, noted small details: the position of the body, the uneven mud around the village green, the peculiar smell of fish mixed with wet leather. Nothing conclusive, but enough to suggest the scene was not quite what it appeared. Hamish drifted back, hands in pockets, watching. He listened to the whispers of the villagers, to the hurried speculations, the half-formed judgments. He observed, who avoided eye contact, who laughed nervously, who adjusted their coat as if hiding something. His mind moved quietly, noting inconsistencies, recognizing patterns invisible to the bluster of Blair's arrival. The rain eased, leaving the village wrapped in damp silence, punctuated by the occasional caw of a crow or the drip of water from the eaves. Hamish took a deep breath of the crisp Highland air and thought, not for the first time, that murder, like the weather here, had its own pace, deliberate, persistent, and often inconveniently timed. Towser nudged his hand, impatient. Hamish patted him, noting that the dog, too, seemed to sense there was more to this than met the eye. He glanced once more at the body, at the scattered belongings, and at the newcomer's briefcase, sitting slightly apart from the puddle of chaos that had become the village green. A little leather tag had been torn from it, almost imperceptibly. Hamish smiled faintly, letting no one see the thought forming in his head. He didn't yet know why, but he suspected that this small detail, so easily overlooked, would matter more than anything Blair could bluster about. And so, with a resigned sigh that only hinted at the thrill beneath it, he prepared himself for a day that promised to be far from lazy. Hamish lingered at the edge of the growing crowd, letting DCI Blair's theatrical gestures dominate the scene while his own eyes roamed quietly, noting what everyone else ignored. Blair barked orders and shouted questions, his voice red and strained, and the villagers shuffled nervously under his gaze. Some were eager to point fingers, others froze, hoping that the storm of authority would pass them by. Towser padded close to Hamish, occasionally glancing at the flustered chief inspector as if sharing a silent assessment, useless, loud, and in need of observation rather than guidance. Hamish's attention, however, was on the small, inconspicuous details that Blair seemed to overlook entirely. The briefcase, sitting slightly off to one side, caught his eye again. The torn leather tag fluttered faintly in the cold breeze, and he noted its odd positioning. Nothing else seemed disturbed, which meant the man hadn't been mugged, or at least not in the straightforward way an outsider might assume. The angle of the body, the absence of footprints except those that were perfectly muddied from the Englishman's own shoes, suggested an altercation, yes, but not the haphazard kind Blair seemed to be imagining. "Hamish, do you see anything?" Blair demanded suddenly, looming over him with a face red enough to frighten a bull. "Or are you just standing there like some idle shepherd?" Hamish blinked slowly, offering only a faint shrug. "Aye, Chief. Plenty to see," he said, letting the words hang ambiguously. It was always best to appear vague with Blair. The less the man understood, the less. Likely he was to attribute skill to Hamish. Blair's ego, fragile and overblown, could be deflected with just a few well-chosen pauses. Meanwhile, the villagers began whispering among themselves. Hamish moved subtly through the crowd, ears attuned to every half-spoken rumour. The postmistress muttered about how the newcomer had complained bitterly about the slow pace of deliveries, while Mrs. MacLeod sniffed that he had been far too keen on pointing out everyone's failings, particularly the proprietress of the hotel. Young Angus, eager to impress, kept edging closer to the body, no doubt hoping for a hero's moment that Hamish suspected would never come. Towser's low growl drew Hamish's eyes to a different direction. By the old stone wall bordering the village green, a shadow lingered, a figure who seemed more interested in the crowd's reaction than the body itself. Hamish noted the posture, the subtle way the hands were tucked into coat pockets, and the unusual stillness. He filed the observation away, like a bookmark for later. Blair, meanwhile, had found a tentative target in young Angus. "You were the last one near him. Didn't you see anything? Answer me," he barked. Angus shook, mumbling something incoherent about the man being loud, rude, and smelly from rain, which only seemed to confirm Blair's prejudiced assumption. Hamish, for his part, stifled a smile. The chief inspector's obvious satisfaction in blaming someone innocent made his job easier, though it also promised more work later to prevent a disastrous arrest. Hamish stepped closer to the body under the guise of examining it, though really he was scrutinizing the newcomer's possessions and the immediate surroundings. A few coins had fallen from a pocket, small and easily overlooked. The man's scarf, twisted and damp, hinted at a struggle, though the scuff marks in the mud didn't correspond to any obvious fight. More telling, Hamish observed, was the faint smell of something metallic and sharp, perhaps a dropped letter opener or a tool from the man's own briefcase. Nothing obvious yet, but enough to suggest that the end had not been random. He glanced up and noticed Blair pacing like a caged animal, muttering half-understood theories about robbery, foreign enemies, and village conspiracies. The villagers began drifting away, uneasy with the prolonged attention and Blair's intensity, leaving Hamish with the silence that he needed. He crouched beside Towser, whispering to the dog, "Keep an eye on the folk, lad. Someone's nervous, and it isn't the Englishman anymore." Moving deliberately slow so Blair wouldn't notice the subtle investigations, Hamish drifted toward the hotel once more. He had to gather information where the villagers felt safest. Over a cup of tea, a scone, a casual remark that revealed more than confession ever could. Mrs. Biggers had returned to her duties, pretending to clean counters while keeping a sharp eye on every patron. She nodded to Hamish discreetly, sliding a plate of biscuits toward him. "He was asking questions," she murmured under her breath, nodding toward the hall. "Too many questions, about everyone." Hamish bit into a biscuit, letting the sweetness and warmth distract him for a moment. Then he noted the way her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't afraid of the Englishman, she'd faced worse, but she was clearly worried about what his curiosity might have uncovered. That was a clue in itself. By mid-morning, Blair had become increasingly loud and insistent, now shouting into his radio for backup that would arrive, he promised, in several hours. Hamish, never one for unnecessary drama, had already begun his quiet rounds of the village, noting who avoided his gaze, who whispered too quickly, and who seemed just a little too helpful. There was the minister, sweeping steps and adjusting his collar, speaking of providence and God's judgment in tones that were far too rehearsed. The curry shop owner leaned against the doorway, offering Hamish a knowing glance, as if to say the newcomer had asked far too many questions over breakfast. The pieces, small and mundane, began to form an outline. Hamish wasn't looking for the dramatic gestures or fingerprints. He was listening to silences, to the things the villagers said around the edges of conversation. He noted that Mr. Cavendish had a habit of noting everyone's weaknesses, of comparing each face to some imagined ideal, and that in a small village, that kind of attention could create enemies faster than a storm whipped through the hills. By noon, Blair had decided he had a suspect in mind and was assembling his notes with furious determination. Hamish, leaning casually against a fence and enjoying the rare warmth of weak winter sunlight breaking through the clouds, simply watched. He let the chief inspector imagine himself in control. Let him imagine the puzzle solved. The truth, Hamish knew, required patience, subtlety, and the willingness to watch as others rushed toward their own errors. Towser padded to his side, pressing against him, and Hamish rubbed the dog's ears. He could almost hear the Englishman's internal panic, already building in the silence of his death, the subtle web of human failings he had left behind. And while Blair prepared to shout guilt at the wrong person, Hamish knew it was only a matter of time before the real story, the petty jealousies, the old grudges, the small but dangerous motivations, would reveal themselves. Hamish took a deep breath of the Highland air, tasting rain, mist, and faint smoke from the distant chimneys, and let his thoughts drift toward the inevitable. Work, yes, but work done quietly, efficiently, and without anyone noticing. He had a full day ahead, and while it was far from lazy, it promised the satisfaction that only came from watching a storm build, and then knowing exactly where it would break. And in Loch Dhu, storms, like murders, always broke in unexpected places. Hamish strolled back into the village, letting the murmur of the departing crowd settle into a low, nervous hum. Blair, of course, was still making a spectacle at the village green, lecturing anyone within earshot on the obviousness of the case and the necessity of immediate arrests. Hamish, however, had little interest in demonstrating obviousness. His mind worked best in quiet observation, in listening to what people didn't say, and in letting the chaos around him do the hard work of revealing secrets. Towser padded close, occasionally nudging Hamish toward the people whose nervousness was too carefully masked, as if the dog had his own sixth sense for dishonesty. The first stop was Mrs. Biggers. The hotel owner was fussing over a fresh pot of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "Hamish," she said in a low voice, leaning toward him. He was asking strange questions. About everyone, about things that don't normally concern outsiders. Hamish sipped the tea, savouring the warmth and letting her words settle. There was nothing overtly threatening in them, but the emphasis on strange questions meant someone in the village had secrets, or believed they did. He wandered through the cobbled streets, keeping a careful eye on who moved and who lingered, who tried to appear casual, and who clutched something in their hand a little too tightly. The postmistress, a sharp-eyed woman with a permanent air of suspicion, caught his attention as she fussed with letters behind the counter. "He asked about the MacLeods," she said softly, glancing toward the street where Blair still ranted. "And the Hamiltons. Said he wanted to understand who ran things around here." Her voice was low, and her words carried the kind of weight only whispered warnings did. Hamish nodded slightly. The Englishman had been probing for influence, testing loyalties, perhaps even gauging resentments. In a village like Loch-Dew, that was dangerous. Hamish drifted next to the curry shop, where the owner was wiping down the counter in a slow, deliberate manner, trying to appear busy while watching the street. "He spoke to my son," the man said quietly, "about old debts, and other things he shouldn't have known." "I don't like the look of it, Hamish." The words were careful, clipped, but they were enough. Hamish's brow furrowed. The newcomer had a habit of seeking out private grievances, little cracks that most people hid carefully. He made a mental note that motive might be personal, small, and messy, rather than grand or financial. By the time he returned to the village green, Blair had grown increasingly animated, and the crowd had thinned even more. "The culprit is right here," Blair shouted, waving a notebook, "and we'll find them soon." Hamish, leaning against a low stone wall, allowed a faint smirk to play at the corners of his mouth. The chief inspector was always eager to make a show of certainty, which often blinded him to subtle truths. Hamish wandered toward the small alley behind the hotel, where he knew a few villagers often retreated to talk in private. Young Angus was lingering there, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Hamish, I didn't see anything," he stammered, eyes wide. "I swear I didn't do anything. I just heard shouting, and then—" His voice trailed off, and Hamish could see the tension tightening in his shoulders. The boy was telling the truth, or at least part of it. "Don't worry, lad," Hamish said softly. "You're not the problem. But you might have seen something small. Details matter." He watched the boy's eyes flicker toward the hotel windows, then to the green. Something in that glance told Hamish that Angus had noticed the newcomer speaking with someone privately, someone influential but discreet. That might be the thread he needed. Hamish continued his quiet survey, moving toward the MacLeod property, where the old family home sat behind a hedge, almost swallowed by the highland mist. Mrs. MacLeod herself appeared at the gate, frowning, but not hostilely. "Hamish, that man, he upset things that were better left alone," she said, glancing over her shoulder, asking questions, poking around. It wasn't just idle curiosity. He knew too much, or thought he did. Hamish nodded, noting her choice of words carefully. Better left alone often meant matters of pride, ancient grudges, or the kind of small personal dishonesty that, in a small village, could turn deadly. He paused by the hedge, listening. The wind carried faint voices from the green, Blair shouting, Towser growling occasionally at a figure too eager to disappear into the crowd. Hamish's gaze drifted to the scattered possessions of the dead man, briefcase, scarf, shoe, and he realized that in all the chaos, one item seemed almost deliberately untouched, a small leather notebook that had slipped partially out of the briefcase. He picked it up, turning it over carefully, noting initials, scribbles, and cryptic references. Nothing overtly incriminating, but enough to suggest the man had been mapping relationships, noting habits, recording grudges. Hamish's thoughts circled back to the villagers he had spoken with, the postmistress, Mrs. Biggers, the curry shop owner. Each had hinted at private tensions, things that an outsider's questions could exacerbate. The newcomer's questions had not been polite, casual inquiries. They had been probing, evaluating, subtly threatening. And that, Hamish realized, might be what led to his violent end. He glanced at Towser, who seemed to understand without words. They moved together, slipping quietly through side streets, observing the quiet tension in the villagers' movements. No one wanted to speak openly under Blair's gaze, but in private corners, the truth leaked in whispers, small gestures, furtive glances. Hamish absorbed it all, weaving the threads together in his mind. The killer, he suspected, was someone underestimated, overlooked, invisible in the daily rhythms of Loch-Dew, but carefully watching the newcomer. By late afternoon, Blair was preparing to make a premature move, convinced he had a lead in the form of an overly nervous shop assistant who had been unlucky enough to be seen arguing with the victim over trivial matters. Hamish observed from a discreet distance, noting the assistant's confusion, the misplaced certainty of Blair, and the subtle indications that the assistant was far from guilty. He allowed the chief inspector to bluster, to puff up with imagined triumph, while he quietly prepared to collect the final pieces of his own understanding. Hamish returned briefly to the hotel, where Mrs. Biggers had prepared a modest lunch, which he devoured while continuing to listen. Snippets of conversation floated from the kitchen, remarks about forgotten promises, old feuds, and petty insults that had festered in the village for years. The newcomer's probing questions had brushed against all of them, and Hamish realised that the murder was unlikely to be about money, theft, or anything grandiose. It was personal, intimate, a crime born of the small but enduring resentments that built up quietly in a village where everyone knew everyone else's business. Towser rested his chin on Hamish's knee, and Hamish looked out at the slowly brightening winter sky. The rain had ceased, leaving a glistening sheen over the cobbles, the mountains framing the village with austere grandeur. The day stretched ahead, long and deliberate, and Hamish allowed himself a faint grin. He had the patience for this. Blair, loud and certain, would make all the mistakes necessary to reveal the truth, if one only waited and watched carefully. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Hamish rose, pulling on his coat. It was time to continue the quiet investigation, to follow the threads whispered in corners and hinted at in glances. Somewhere in the mundane rituals of Loch Dhu, the real story was waiting, and Hamish Macbeth, who appeared lazy, distracted, and uncaring, would find it, slowly, patiently, and without anyone realizing that he already knew far more than they imagined. The storm had passed, but the ripples of tension, curiosity, and hidden grudges had only begun to surface, and Hamish, with Towser at his side, moved into the spaces between words, waiting for the villagers themselves to reveal the secret that had cost the newcomer his life. Hamish moved quietly through the village, letting the fading sunlight glint off the wet cobbles as he passed familiar doorways. Blair was still at the green, shouting at anyone who lingered too long, convinced the drama required maximum public attention. Hamish, by contrast, had learned long ago that the truth rarely revealed itself in shouts. It hid in the pauses, in half-spoken sentences over teacups, and in the tiny gestures that people made when they thought no one was looking. Towser padded faithfully beside him, occasionally sniffing at footprints or lingering where a shadow seemed to hover a little too long. The first stop was the post office, where the postmistress fussed with the ledgers as though they were sacred relics. "Hamish," she whispered, leaning forward slightly, "I shouldn't even be saying this, but he asked about things, private things, about letters, parcels, accounts, people he shouldn't have been asking about." Her sharp eyes flicked nervously toward the street. Hamish sipped a quick cup of tea, savouring the warmth, letting her words settle. She didn't accuse anyone outright, but the unease in her voice spoke volumes. He had learned that in Loch Dhu, fear often whispered the truth more reliably than pride or anger ever could. From there he wandered toward the MacLeod residence, where Mrs. MacLeod had taken to pacing in her small garden, her hands twisting the shawl around her shoulders. "Hamish, I don't know how to say this." But he was looking at everyone, asking questions about old disagreements, petty debts, about promises made years ago, things we'd all thought forgotten. She sighed, looking down the lane as if expecting some phantom to emerge. Hamish nodded slowly. The Englishman had been poking at the hidden edges of the village, tugging on threads that should never have been disturbed. In Loch Dhu, such curiosity could be dangerous. He paused briefly at the village bakery, where the baker, flour still clinging to his coat, gave Hamish a cautious smile. He asked about customers, he said softly, and about private exchanges. Said he wanted to know who influenced who. Made a lot of people nervous. Even the minister looked a bit off. Hamish's brow furrowed. It was becoming clear that the man had been mapping relationships, perhaps hoping to leverage them, perhaps out of idle curiosity. In a village of a few hundred, such probing could make enemies almost instantly. Towser tugged at his sleeve, guiding him toward the alley behind the hotel. Young Angus lingered there, fidgeting with the hem of his coat. "Hamish, I didn't see anything." "Really?" he stammered. Hamish crouched, letting the boy's wide eyes meet his. "Angus, lad, I'm not interested in blame. Just details. Something small. Something that doesn't make sense yet." The boy's gaze flitted toward the hotel windows and then to the green, as if reluctant to admit he had noticed an argument. a private, tense exchange between the newcomer and someone he had presumed harmless. Hamish filed it away, noting the importance of observation over confession. By late afternoon, Blair had decided to focus on a shop assistant who had been overheard arguing with the victim over a trivial matter. Hamish watched from a discreet distance as the chief inspector interrogated the young man, making loud, accusatory gestures that sent the villagers scurrying. The assistant's protest seemed sincere, but Blair's certainty was immovable. Hamish allowed the chief inspector his imagined triumph, knowing that it would only hasten the real revelations. Hamish returned briefly to the hotel where Mrs. Biggers had prepared a modest repast, tea and scones arranged with careful precision. He was asking questions, she said, almost sotto voce, about everyone's routines, private details, even small debts, small favours, old promises. He seemed to know them all, or at least wanted to. Hamish nibbled a scone thoughtfully, savouring the subtle sweetness while mentally tracing the web of the newcomer's inquiries. The victim's curiosity had likely stirred old grudges, resurfaced jealousies, and touched nerves that had lain dormant for years. He drifted next to the stone wall bordering the village green, letting Towser roam a few yards ahead. The dog stopped, growling faintly at a figure lingering just beyond the usual path of villagers returning home. Hamish watched the figure, noting the careful avoidance of eye contact and the subtle tension in posture. Invisible to Blair, who was still caught up in his self-important theatrics. The figure's nervous attention to the scene suggested knowledge of more than they would admit. Small clues began to accumulate like rainwater in the gutters. A faint smudge on the victim's briefcase, a torn leather tag fluttering in the breeze, a footpath slightly disturbed as though someone had retraced their steps carefully. None of it made sense in isolation, but together it suggested that the newcomer's end had not been random. He had been targeted deliberately, but in a way that relied on subtlety rather than brute force. Someone had used his own habits, his own probing curiosity, against him. Hamish spent the evening moving quietly from house to house, teacups in hand, listening to whispers of old disputes and buried resentments. Every villager he spoke to offered tiny fragments, frustration with the newcomer's arrogance, irritation at being questioned about minor failings, memories of past slights. Each detail seemed insignificant, yet Hamish understood instinctively that these were the threads from which the motive had been woven. By the time darkness fell, the village had returned to its usual quiet, though the air was thick with unease. Blair was back at the hotel, preparing to compile his notes, his ego fully inflated by the imagined certainty of having solved the case. Hamish leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, observing the chief inspector's bluster with mild amusement. Towser rested at his feet, tail twitching in quiet anticipation. Hamish's mind, however, was far from idle. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly forming an outline. The victim had poked into private matters, uncovering small tensions that had persisted beneath the surface of the village. Someone had taken offence, not at the grander notions of crime or finance, but at personal curiosity, at probing where they should not have. And that someone, Hamish suspected, was careful, patient, and underestimated, a person who moved quietly through the village, unnoticed, invisible, until the moment they struck. He glanced at the snow beginning to dust the rooftops, the highland wind curling around chimneys and walls, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and damp earth. Somewhere in the folds of everyday life, the answer waited, hidden in plain sight, and Hamish, slow, deliberate, and seemingly unmotivated, would find it, not with shouting or orders, but by listening, watching, and understanding the quiet patterns of Loch Dhu. As he finally allowed himself to sit, cup of tea in hand, Towser resting beside him, Hamish reflected that this was the kind of work he preferred, subtle, unhurried, and hidden from the eyes of those who sought only to make a show of solving things. Blair could have his loud gestures and imagined triumphs. Hamish would have the truth, quietly assembled, and ready to reveal itself in its own time. And in Loch Dhu, as the last light faded behind the mountains, he knew the real storm was only beginning. A storm of old resentments, careful observations, and human weaknesses that no outsider, however clever, could anticipate. Hamish had just settled into a quiet corner of the hotel, steaming cup of tea in hand and Towser curled at his feet, when the door opened with a soft chime that immediately shifted the atmosphere. She stepped in like a ray of light cutting through the highland gloom. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, impeccably dressed as always, yet somehow managing not to look entirely out of place among Lochdu's stone and slate. Her eyes swept over the room, noting the scattered papers, the lingering smell of rain, and finally, Hamish himself, looking deceptively dishevelled and entirely unconcerned. "Hamish," she said softly, slipping into the seat opposite him, "I hear there's been trouble. I'm so very sorry." Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, betraying the impatience she always tried to conceal with elegance. Hamish sipped his tea slowly, letting the warmth spread through him before responding. "Aye, trouble's one way of putting it," he said mildly. "Englishman's curiosity got the better of him. Lochdu has a way of dealing with such things, usually quietly, but it seems he wanted to shake up a few old ghosts first." He let his gaze linger on her, noting her reaction. She had the sharpness to notice small nuances, the kind that most outsiders missed, and that often made her observations invaluable. Priscilla leaned closer. "I heard he was asking questions, personal ones, about debts, grudges, old promises, and people are upset, nervous even." She paused, looking over her shoulder as if to ensure no one else was listening, then added, "Some of it might be nothing, Hamish, but I suspect he touched nerves that shouldn't have been disturbed." Hamish nodded slowly. "That's precisely it. He asked, he listened, he judged. And someone didn't like being judged." He let the words hang in the warm, tea-scented air. "And that someone isn't necessarily obvious, Priscilla, or loud, or guilty-looking." He watched her eyes narrow slightly. She always liked to puzzle things out herself before speaking. "I think I might know," she said quietly, "who he spoke to yesterday morning. At the hotel, there were whispers, and a few of us noticed. He was persistent, insisting on details most would consider private, even trivial, and the way some villagers reacted. It was almost as though they feared him, rather than the other way around." Her voice was steady, but there was an intensity there, a spark that reminded Hamish why he sometimes relied on her insight. He leaned back, taking a thoughtful sip of tea. Persistence can be dangerous in the wrong hands, and the wrong hands, in Lochdu, have a way of responding when poked too sharply. His eyes flicked toward the window, where the last light of day was fading into mist-shrouded hills. "The question is, which hand responded this time?" Priscilla's expression softened slightly, though a shadow of worry lingered. "Hamish, you must be careful. Blair is predictable. He'll accuse the first person who looks guilty and never notice the subtle details you're likely seeing." Hamish smiled faintly, though he knew she wasn't finished. "I might be able to help. I know who tends to move quietly, who observes, and who might have grievances that aren't immediately obvious. Small grievances long remembered, and sometimes more dangerous than any large scheme." He set down his cup, the warm tea forgotten for the moment. "Aye, that's the sort of insight I need. You're sharp, Priscilla, and you notice the things people think they hide." He paused, considering carefully. "Tell me everything you know. Every minor complaint, every whispered slight, even things that seem insignificant. That's how these matters unravel." She nodded, leaning closer, speaking in a hushed tone as though the walls themselves might be listening. She recounted a series of incidents, complaints about unpaid debts, minor insults, minor jealousies, tiny irritants that had persisted over years and could easily have fermented into a darker response when touched by the newcomer's questions. As she spoke, Hamish jotted mental notes, connecting each story to the villagers he had already observed earlier in the day. Patterns emerged, small tensions, old rivalries, and an almost imperceptible sense of competition between families and neighbours. Towser stirred beside him, ears alert, as though sensing the tension in the room. Hamish reached down, scratching behind the dog's ears absently while continuing to absorb the information. He considered the victim's behaviour, persistent, probing, unconcerned with the subtle hierarchies and resentments of a small village, and realised that the killer was likely someone underestimated by both the newcomer and Blair, someone whose presence had been invisible until the moment they acted. Priscilla paused, hesitating for a heartbeat before adding, "There's also the matter of the MacLeods. He asked about their past, their affairs, debts, things that go back decades. Even the minister seemed uncomfortable when he mentioned them." Hamish's mind sharpened. He had suspected the personal nature of the motive, but this confirmed it. The crime wasn't opportunistic, nor motivated by money. It was about pride, resentment, and the careful exploitation of private knowledge. "Good," he said quietly. "You've confirmed my suspicions." He was poking at old wounds, and someone decided it was time to teach him a lesson. Subtle, personal, precise. He let that thought settle, realizing that the killer had likely struck swiftly, almost without thought for the spectacle, relying on the victim's own habits to facilitate the act. Priscilla's eyes met his, sharp and questioning. "Hamish, can you manage this without Blair taking the credit, or worse, interfering?" Hamish gave a faint, almost imperceptible shrug. "I'll handle it. Let him bluster. He likes to think he's in control. I'll let him play his game while I watch the moves that matter." They spent the next hour tracing minor connections, reviewing who had interacted with the victim most recently, and noting who had reacted nervously in his presence. Priscilla offered subtle insights, gestures, expressions, and moments of hesitation she had observed, all unnoticed by Blair. Hamish filed each away, linking them in his mind like strands in a net. By the time they concluded, the evening light had almost vanished, leaving the village draped in mist and shadow. Hamish stepped outside, Towser padding at his side, and inhaled the crisp, cold air. The mountains loomed dark and silent, and the wind carried with it the faint scent of wood smoke, rain, and the damp earth of the fields. He felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. The pieces were aligning, the web of small grievances and subtle tensions coming together, and he had Priscilla's observations to sharpen his understanding. He looked back toward the hotel where Blair was still organizing his papers, confident in his imagined progress. Hamish allowed himself a faint smile. The chief inspector could make all the noise he liked, but it would be Hamish, quietly, slowly, who would see the hidden motivations and invisible patterns. Towser nudged him gently, and Hamish patted the dog's head. The night was settling over Loch Dhu, but the storm of human emotions, petty resentments, and carefully hidden motives was far from over. Somewhere in that quiet tension lay the answer, and Hamish Macbeth, slow, watchful, and deceptively idle, intended to uncover it, one subtle observation at a time, and for once, he allowed himself a thought he rarely admitted aloud. It was satisfying, in a quiet, Highland sort of way, to have someone like Priscilla at his side, adding clarity to the tangled web of gossip, secrecy, and old grudges that had become the true heart of the mystery. The next morning arrived over Loch Dhu with a thin sun cutting through lingering mist, illuminating the village in a soft, almost forgiving light. Hamish stirred slowly, savouring the calm before the inevitable storm. Towser padded at his heels as he walked through the quiet streets, noting who had emerged and who lingered indoors, peering through frost-specked windows. Blair, naturally, had arrived hours earlier, already puffing up in the square like a man certain he had solved the case. He barked orders, his notebook clutched like a weapon, and Hamish allowed him the illusion of control while moving quietly to observe the villagers themselves. The chief inspector had identified his latest target, a young shop assistant who had been overheard murmuring complaints to a colleague. Blair's certainty was breathtaking in its simplicity. Hamish watched from a discreet distance as Blair's interrogation began, shouting over the assistant's protests, waving his arms like a conductor without an orchestra. The assistant's confusion, the slight quaver in his voice, and the hastily denied accusations were all clear signs to Hamish that Blair had once again picked the wrong person. Yet it was not enough merely to observe. Hamish drifted toward the corner of the square, where a few villagers had gathered for morning errands. Their whispered conversations carried fragments of the previous day, complaints about the newcomers' probing questions, mentions of minor slights, and, most tellingly, a subtle fear in those who had once thought themselves unnoticed. Hamish noted the slight hesitation of Mrs. MacLeod as she exchanged greetings with a neighbour, the careful way her fingers clutched her basket, and the almost imperceptible glance toward the river where the newcomer had been walking the day before. Small details, almost invisible to anyone who did not know the rhythms of Loch Dhu, and yet, for Hamish, invaluable. He wandered past the bakery, where the baker nodded discreetly. "He was asking about everyone yesterday," the man murmured, wiping his flour-streaked hands on his apron. "Even about things that don't normally matter. Debts, promises, old disagreements." Hamish listened, absorbing every word, filing away names and relationships like a patient spider weaving a web. The killer, he suspected, was someone underestimated, someone who moved quietly, whose presence was barely noticed, until the moment they acted. Towser tugged gently at his sleeve, urging him down a narrow lane that led toward the back of the MacLeod property. Hamish allowed the dog to guide him, noting how the villagers instinctively avoided this route, as though they feared drawing attention to themselves. At the end of the lane, hidden behind a hedge, he found a small clue the others had overlooked, a scrap of fabric, slightly muddy, that had not belonged to the victim. He examined it carefully, noting the weave, the colour, and the faint scent of perfume lingering in the fibres. Nothing overt, yet enough to suggest someone had been there, someone who might have reacted when the newcomer asked too many questions. By mid-morning, Blair had grown increasingly confident in his chosen suspect, convinced that the assistant's nervousness equated guilt. Hamish watched, arms crossed, as the chief inspector wrote rapidly in his notebook, punctuating every line with exclamations and accusations. The assistant, pale and trembling, offered protests that fell on deaf ears, the villagers watching in a mixture of fear and quiet exasperation. Hamish knew this would not end well unless he intervened with careful observation rather than overt action. Hamish moved to the edge of the hotel veranda, where Mrs. Biggers was arranging cups of tea for anyone who might linger. "He was asking questions yesterday morning," she whispered, nodding toward the now empty square. "Things about people's habits, debts, and little slights, things you'd think were forgotten. He made some people nervous, afraid even." Hamish sipped the tea, letting warmth and caffeine sharpen his focus. This confirmed his growing theory. The murder was not about money, robbery, or grand designs. It was personal. Small, petty, human grievances. He drifted next toward the corner near the river, where the newcomer had been seen walking with a notebook, jotting observations. The ground was damp from last night's mist, but Hamish could make out faint footprints alongside the normal muddiness of the path. The prints were uneven, suggesting someone had walked slowly, almost deliberately retracing steps. He crouched, noting the subtle differences between the victim's shoes and those who might have followed him. A pattern emerged, not just movement, but timing. Someone had tracked him unnoticed, waiting for the right moment. Hamish returned briefly to the hotel for a quick bite, picking at a sandwich while listening to small snippets of conversation from other guests and staff. A passing remark about a long-standing dispute between two families caught his attention. Another mentioned a forgotten promise, now painfully remembered after. The newcomer's intrusive questioning, each tiny detail fed into a mental map, connecting people, grudges, and minor humiliations that had quietly festered over years. Hamish realized that these small, almost invisible tensions were likely the true motive, the spark that led someone to murder a man who, in their eyes, had overstepped bounds better left untouched. Towser nudged him again, and Hamish stepped outside just as Blair prepared to make his move, gathering his evidence to confront the trembling assistant. Hamish allowed a faint smile. The chief inspector was about to commit a classic error, but the distraction served him well. It kept others from watching Hamish too closely as he followed subtler threads. A glance at Priscilla, who had returned to offer another discreet observation, confirmed what he suspected. Blair would blunder, but the truth was within reach, hidden in plain sight, obscured only by loud certainties and overlooked subtleties. By late afternoon, Hamish had begun piecing together the timeline of the newcomer's final hours. He realized that the man's probing questions had touched nerves he could not have anticipated. Someone had felt exposed, watched, perhaps even humiliated, and had acted with sudden precision. The evidence was scattered and subtle, a misplaced briefcase tag, a faint smear of mud, nervous glances, and hushed remarks. But together, it suggested deliberate intent. Not robbery, not passion, but petty, human indignation turned violent. Hamish leaned against the stone wall, watching the wind curl around the rooftops and the mountains beyond, his mind ticking through the network of motives and interactions he had observed. The village's tensions were almost imperceptible to outsiders, but to him they were clear as the pattern of the river in winter. The killer had relied on invisibility, the quiet strength of being unnoticed, to strike, and Blair's bluster would not uncover it. Towser rested his chin on Hamish's boot and he patted the dog absently, letting the cool evening air clear his thoughts. Soon he decided the pieces would come together. He had observed the subtle movements, the nervous habits, and the minor grudges that would lead him to the person no one suspected. Blair could claim the noise and public accusations, but Hamish would find the truth quietly, efficiently, and without anyone realizing how close they had come to the edge of disaster. As the first stars appeared over the Highland peaks, Hamish allowed himself a faint, wry smile. The red herring was poised, the real culprit unnoticed, and the intricate web of human folly was beginning to unravel exactly as he suspected it would. In Loch Dhu, patience, observation, and a careful understanding of people were worth far more than shouts and notebooks. And Hamish, slow-moving, deceptively idle, and quietly relentless, intended to watch it all unfold. The morning arrived grey and heavy with mist, the Highland air thick and damp as Hamish made his way down the cobbled street, Towser padding silently at his side. The village was quieter than usual. Those who remained at home peered nervously through frost-specked windows, glancing at Blair and his team as they bellowed and scribbled, convinced their suspect would soon be paraded into public shame. Hamish, however, had little interest in witnessing such theatrics. He was after subtler truths, the ones that hid in whispered gossip, fleeting glances, and overlooked movements. He stopped briefly at the post office, where the postmistress was already busy arranging parcels, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "Hamish," she said quietly, leaning toward him, I think you need to know who he spoke with last. It was not just anyone. He was speaking to someone who usually keeps themselves unseen. Quiet, polite, unnoticed. But they flinched when he pressed too hard. Hamish's eyes narrowed, his thoughts immediately racing. In Loch Dhu, the invisible often wielded the sharpest knives. He thanked her softly and moved on, letting the detail settle in his mind. Towser led him instinctively toward the rear of the village green, where footprints still marred the muddy grass. The prints were faint, but Hamish traced them carefully, noting slight irregularities. One set of shoes hesitated, pivoted, then retreated. The pattern suggested a confrontation, brief but tense, not a struggle of brute force. He crouched, studying the subtle impressions in the mud, and his sharp eyes caught something almost invisible, a small scrap of fabric snagged on a low branch. It was delicate, feminine in nature, and distinctly out of place. He pocketed the scrap, letting it rest against his palm as he moved toward the Macleod property. Mrs. Macleod, noticing him, hesitated at the gate. "Hamish, have you—" she began, then faltered, uncertain how much to reveal. Hamish, with a faint, reassuring nod, encouraged her to continue. She spoke quietly, confirming that the newcomer had pressed her about old family disputes and minor grievances, but in a way that left her unsettled rather than angry. Hamish realized the pattern emerging. The victim had inadvertently touched nerves long buried, and someone had acted to stop him, not through premeditated malice, but through instinctive personal offence. By mid-morning, Blair was growing increasingly impatient. His suspect, the trembling shop assistant, had been escorted to the square for what Blair believed would be the inevitable confession. Hamish lingered at the edge, pretending to adjust his coat while observing the nervous faces in the crowd. The assistant's protests were sincere, their tone innocent, yet Blair was deaf to nuance, certain that volume equated truth. Hamish allowed a faint smile. The chief inspector's blunders were, as always, illuminating in their predictability. Hamish's thoughts returned to the scrap of fabric. He compared it with the briefcase tag, the victim's shoes, and the footprints he had studied. The fabric suggested a presence at the scene overlooked by Blair's team, a person quiet, careful, and perhaps underestimated. He retraced the victim's last known steps in his mind, aligning them with the small fragments of gossip he had collected from Priscilla, Mrs. Biggers, and the postmistress. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged. The victim had not been killed for financial gain or out of random malice. He had been killed because someone's pride, dignity, or long-harboured resentment had been threatened by his probing. Towser tugged at his sleeve, drawing Hamish's attention to a faint trail leading toward the riverbank. The path was narrow, partially hidden by low brush, and Hamish recognized it as the route the victim had likely taken while walking in the morning mist. The prints were sporadic, suggesting a moment of hesitation, a confrontation perhaps, followed by a retreat. At the edge of the bank he spotted a small indentation in the mud, faint but telling. Someone had knelt or crouched there, carefully positioning themselves. A subtle detail, almost imperceptible, yet enough to indicate the killer's precise movements. He returned to the hotel briefly to regroup, sipping a steaming cup of tea while reviewing his mental notes. Priscilla had arrived once again, her sharp eyes bright with concern and curiosity. "Hamish," she said softly, leaning across the table. "I think you're close. The person you're looking for isn't loud, isn't obvious. They hide behind routine and politeness. You'll find them where you least expect it." Hamish nodded, his thoughts aligning with hers. The killer was patient, cunning in a quiet way, and confident that their subtlety would protect them from Blair's bluster. By late morning he returned to the riverbank. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing more details, a faint smear of mud on a low branch, footprints partially erased by rain, and, most crucially, a discarded glove tucked into the grass, a second feminine item, unmistakably, matching the scrap of fabric from the other day. Hamish crouched, examining it carefully. There was a faint scent lingering on the leather, a faint trace of perfume, enough to indicate proximity to the victim, and enough to suggest a person who had been present at the moment of the incident, but had attempted to leave no mark. He retraced the steps silently, piecing together the sequence of events. The victim had been followed, confronted, and struck in a moment of personal anger rather than calculated planning. The items left behind, fabric, glove, minor disturbances in the mud, were not evidence of a struggle but of careful observation, a patient approach that relied on the victim's own habits to facilitate the act. Hamish's mind worked through the possibilities, eliminating the bluster-driven assumptions of Blair and the innocent but nervous assistant who had been prepared to take the fall. Hamish allowed himself a rare smile, realizing that the red herring was clear. Blair's chosen suspect was entirely innocent, the victim's end orchestrated by someone quiet, underestimated, and motivated by long festering grievance. He glanced toward the village green, where Blair was preparing his triumphant confrontation, unaware that his logic was fatally flawed. Hamish's advantage lay in patience and observation. The killer had left subtle marks, ones only he could read. Towser nudged him gently, and Hamish stood pocketing the glove. He had the threads of the motive, the sequence of events, and the identity of the overlooked perpetrator forming clearly in his mind. The clues, small and almost invisible, pointed to someone whose anger was personal, whose act was impulsive yet deliberate, and whose confidence in invisibility had been their undoing. The pattern was no longer vague, it was precise, and Hamish knew the moment for action would come soon. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Hamish returned briefly to the hotel to review his observations with Priscilla. They discussed minor grievances, subtle tensions, and the ways the victim's probing questions had inflamed hidden anger. Each detail fit neatly into the emerging picture: a quiet person, underestimated by outsiders and Blair alike, who had allowed their sense of personal insult to dictate the fatal act. Hamish's eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of the puzzle nearly solved, the threads woven carefully, and the red herring firmly identified and discarded. By evening, the village had settled into uneasy quiet. Blair, oblivious to the truths Hamish had discerned, continued to prepare for his dramatic arrest, convinced in his certainty. Hamish, sipping a final cup of tea and glancing toward the Highland peaks, allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The killer was not where Blair expected, nor was the motive what the chief inspector assumed. The pieces were falling into place, the subtle human tensions exposed, and Hamish Macbeth, slow-moving, deceptively idle, and quietly perceptive, was ready to bring the threads together. Towser rested at his feet, alert but patient, as Hamish considered his next move. The trap would be set subtly, quietly, using the assumptions and bluster of others to his advantage. The red herring was neutralized, the real culprit identified in his mind, and the quiet work of observation had revealed what loud accusations never could. In the misted stillness of Lochdu, Hamish smiled faintly. The final act was approaching, and it would require nothing more than patience, careful misdirection, and the subtle orchestration of human behavior. the kind of work he excelled at, unseen and unappreciated, yet always effective. Hamish had spent the early evening in quiet observation, letting the village settle into its usual Highland rhythm, while Blair continued to parade his imaginary victories. Towser padded faithfully at his heels as he walked through the thin mist curling over Lochdu's cobbled streets, eyes alert for the smallest movement, ears tuned to the faintest whisper. The trap he had been shaping in his mind all day was ready to be set. It required nothing more than patience, subtle misdirection, and the natural vanity of a small-town killer who believed themselves cleverer than they truly were. It began with the obvious, rumour. Hamish knew that gossip in Lochdu travelled faster than the wind over the hills, and that a well-placed word could provoke more reaction than any formal accusation. With Towser following, he strolled past the MacLeod house, letting his voice carry just enough for the few watching neighbours to hear, mentioning in passing, "I wonder if anyone realises that secrets never stay buried, not here, not in Lochdu." It was vague, harmless in content, but precise in timing. Hamish observed the reaction of a figure at the window, the subtle stiffening of posture, a hand clenching the curtain edge. That was the first sign. The person had heard enough to feel the implications. Next, he moved toward the hotel, where Blair was rehearsing his speech to the assembled villagers, ready to announce the impending arrest of the nervous shop assistant. Hamish, pretending casual interest, entered the lobby, sipped his tea, and let slip a few carefully crafted observations. "Funny, isn't it?" he murmured in a tone just loud enough for the hotel staff to hear. "How some people's stories never quite add up. You'd think the neat little routines of Lochdu were unbreakable, but even the quietest habits can betray you." Towser's low growl underlined the remark, adding weight without explanation. A few villagers exchanged furtive glances. One particular individual, whom Hamish had identified mentally over the last 2 days, shifted uneasily and moved toward the exit. That was exactly the effect he had hoped for. By mid-evening, he had traced the person discreetly through the village, letting them believe they were unobserved. The mist had thickened, curling around lampposts and houses, offering cover for Hamish's patient surveillance. He noted their nervous gestures, the repeated glances over the shoulder, the clutching of an item hidden under their coat, and the slight hesitation at intersections. Each movement confirmed what he had suspected. The killer was meticulous in their discretion, but prone to reveal themselves when they believed the attention of the village, or Blair, was elsewhere. Hamish decided to add a small, tempting element to the trap. He left an envelope conspicuously on the hotel doorstep, containing a note that suggested someone else had witnessed critical details of the incident, carefully phrased, just enough to suggest observation without stating specifics. Then he withdrew into the shadows with Towser, observing as the figure approached, visibly agitated, and finally, in a quiet panic, began speaking to a trusted friend, revealing more than they intended. Every word, every gesture, was a confirmation of what Hamish had already pieced together. The murder had been personal, motivated by irritation, old grudges, and the subtle humiliation the victim had inadvertently inflicted by his questions. Meanwhile, Blair had stationed himself conspicuously in the square, certain that the shop assistant would break under pressure at any moment. His voice carried across the mist, booming accusations that drew the attention of a few lingering villagers. Hamish watched with mild amusement. Blair's certainty was a perfect foil, ensuring the killer believed the official investigation was blind to their presence and activity. In a village like Lochdu, that confidence could be more dangerous than any actual threat. It made people act impulsively, and impulsive actions often revealed the truth. Towser tugged at Hamish's sleeve, directing him toward a narrow alley that the suspect had used to retreat from the hotel. Hamish followed silently, noting footprints in the damp cobbles and a faint trace of perfume that matched the fabric and glove he had discovered earlier. The killer was moving carefully, but they were unsettled, their attention split between their own panic and the assumed authority of Blair. Hamish smiled faintly. The final reveal was approaching. He allowed the figure to reach a secluded corner before stepping out of the shadows, speaking quietly but firmly. "Aye, it's easier when you think no one is watching, isn't it? The individual froze, glancing wildly at Hamish, then down at Towser, who remained calm but alert. The panic was unmistakable. "You think the Sassenach man's death is hidden, but the threads are all here," Hamish continued, letting his tone remain mild, deceptively unhurried. "Every step, every glance, every small grievance you've carried, it all tells a story." The person's composure crumbled. Words tumbled out, admissions, half-excuses, rationalizations that confirmed Hamish's deductions. They had acted out of anger, personal irritation, and an old resentment that the victim's persistent questions had brought to the surface. It was not premeditation in the grand sense, but a sudden, decisive act that relied on invisibility and assumed indifference. Hamish listened quietly, allowing the confession to unfold naturally, noting the details that confirmed his theory and exonerated the innocent shop assistant Blair was preparing to accuse. By the time the confession was complete, Hamish had the full picture, a series of small slights and forgotten grievances, a careful observation of the victim's habits, and a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. It was precise, subtle, and wholly personal. He guided the killer to a bench where they could sit, still under the gentle weight of their own panic, while he made a quiet call to Blair. The chief inspector arrived moments later, red-faced and fuming, expecting triumph, only to be handed the neatly solved outcome by Hamish with the killer visibly present. Blair sputtered, attempting to regain the upper hand, but Hamish calmly explained the threads of observation, the subtle clues, and the sequence of events that led to the capture. The red herring, the shop assistant, was cleared, the true motive revealed, and the village was spared the humiliation of an unjust accusation. Hamish's patient orchestration had worked perfectly, relying on human nature, the power of subtle suggestion and the predictable arrogance of both Blair and the killer. Towser rested his chin on Hamish's boot, watching as the village absorbed the revelation with a mixture of relief, astonishment, and quiet judgment. The storm of whispers, small grievances, and hidden tensions had been transformed into a coherent narrative, exposing the truth without violence or spectacle beyond the confession itself. Blair, despite his bluster, took the formal credit, unaware that it was Hamish's careful observation, patience, and subtle manipulation that had brought the case to its conclusion. Hamish allowed himself a faint smile as he guided Towser back down the misted streets, the last light fading behind the mountains. The village's rhythms were restored, the subtle tensions eased, and the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved without fanfare settled over him like a warm Highland cloak. He had achieved exactly what he intended, justice accomplished, the true culprit revealed, and his own involvement hidden beneath the veil of normalcy. The night deepened, the wind curling around chimneys and over the fields, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Hamish reflected, as he often did after such events, that the greatest power in Loch-Dhu lay not in loud declarations or formal authority, but in understanding people, their habits, their fears, and the quiet grudges they carried. Blair might take the credit, but Hamish would remain here, slow-moving, deceptively idle, and quietly indispensable. Towser's soft sigh punctuated the night, and Hamish, allowing himself one last glance at the darkened village, thought with a rare warmth that this was exactly the life he wanted, observing, solving, and slipping quietly back into the comfortable rhythms of Loch-Dhu, where even murder could not disrupt the subtle order of human behaviour for long. The morning after the confession, Loch-Dhu stirred to life as if nothing untoward had happened at all, which in a way suited Hamish perfectly. The mist still clung to the hills, curling like faint smoke over the rooftops, but the villagers were out, performing their routines with cautious normality. Blair had announced the capture of the culprit, striding through the square with a triumphant air, the shop assistant now fully exonerated, though still pale and trembling. Hamish, sipping a hot cup of coffee on the veranda of the hotel, let him have his moment. There was a satisfaction in watching the chief inspector bask in what he believed was glory, while Hamish quietly held the real story in his mind, like a secret warmth against the Highland chill. Towser rested his chin across Hamish's boots, eyes half closed, perfectly content with the return to routine. Hamish took a slow sip of coffee, savouring the rich bitterness, and allowed himself to watch the subtle movements of the villagers. Faces that had been tense with fear and curiosity yesterday now carried a faint relief. Some nodded discreetly toward him, recognizing that the balance had been restored, even if Blair took the formal credit. He smiled faintly. That was precisely how he liked it. Justice served, chaos minimized, and his own reputation intact, quiet, invisible, and entirely unsullied by public attention. Priscilla Halberton Smythe appeared shortly after, carrying a small basket of scones and wearing a carefully neutral expression. She paused beside him, offering a gentle smile. "So, it's over," she said, settling herself beside him and letting her gaze sweep over the square. "Blair will take the applause, of course." She raised an eyebrow. "And you?" Hamish gave a faint shrug, allowing the cup to linger, halfway to his lips. "I'll have the pleasure of knowing the truth, Priscilla. That's enough for me. Blair's loud, but the village, and I, know who did the work quietly." Towser gave a soft grunt of agreement and nudged Hamish's hand. The dog's calm presence seemed to anchor the stillness that had returned to Loch Dhu, the gentle rhythm of life resuming its quiet cadence. Hamish's mind drifted over the events of the past days, the subtle observations, the quiet patterns, the small threads of gossip and human behaviour that had revealed the killer. No violence, no dramatic confrontations beyond the moment of confession, just patience, careful attention, and an understanding of human nature that Blair would never acquire. He glanced toward the mountains, where the mist was lifting to reveal the sharp edges of the peaks in the pale winter sun. The wind brought with it the familiar scent of wet earth, smoke, and distant wood fires. Everything seemed right, balanced once more. The villagers moved past, exchanging soft greetings, their relief mingling with residual curiosity. Hamish noted their minor gestures, a flick of the hand, a careful glance, a small smile at a neighbour. Each spoke volumes, and he allowed himself the quiet pleasure of reading the human script that Blair could only misinterpret with his loud, confident declarations. Priscilla, noticing his reflective mood, reached over to offer a warm, steadying touch to his arm. "It was clever, the way you managed it," she said softly. "Blair never saw it coming." Hamish gave a faint, self-deprecating grin. "Aye, clever perhaps, but mostly patience. And knowing that people tend to reveal themselves in the smallest ways if you only watch." Towser wagged his tail, as if in agreement, and Hamish laughed quietly, a sound almost swallowed by the Highland wind. Blair, meanwhile, had gathered the villagers for what he intended as a public display of law and order, expounding on his perceived brilliance and the inevitability of the arrest. Hamish watched from the edge, the coffee now warm but almost forgotten, and noted the subtle eye contact among the villagers, relief, amusement, and recognition that the truth had been quietly restored by someone who had truly understood the human landscape. Blair's words carried no weight beyond their volume, while the real understanding settled gently in the minds of those who mattered. Hamish allowed the moment to stretch, sipping the coffee and watching as life resumed its delicate rhythm. Small errands, quiet greetings, children darting through the alleys, each ordinary act a reminder that Loch Dhu's order was never fragile, it only required careful stewardship. He felt the familiar satisfaction of a problem solved without spectacle, the quiet triumph of subtlety over bluster, patience over panic. In this village, loudness often drew attention, but observation, calm, deliberate, and understated, was power. Towser shifted, nudging Hamish to indicate it was time to move, and he rose slowly, the weight of the past days settling comfortably across his shoulders. He made his way toward the hotel kitchen, where a fresh pot of stew simmered and the scent of baking bread filled the air. Mrs. Biggers waved cheerfully, oblivious to the quiet intricacies of the investigation, but delighted to see her favourite policeman back in good spirits. Hamish allowed himself a small smile, settling down to the warmth, the food, and the familiar routines that he so dearly loved. Priscilla lingered a moment, her eyes catching his, in a look of quiet amusement. "You never do things in a hurry, Hamish," she said softly, "and yet somehow you always get there in the end." He gave a faint shrug, cutting a slice of bread. "Slow and steady, Priscilla. Slow and steady keeps me here, and keeps the village in one piece." Towser rested his chin on Hamish's knee, and for the first time in days, the world felt entirely calm. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the chimneys and curling. around the mountains, carrying the scent of peat and frost. A few villagers passed by, pausing to wave or nod. The tension of the murder investigation had lifted, replaced by the comfortable hum of everyday life. Hamish reflected that this was the way he liked it: quiet, methodical, and entirely unspectacular to outsiders, yet perfectly in order. Blair might take the credit, the village might remember the dramatic arrest, but Hamish, content and unbothered, would return to his preferred state of observation, reflection, and the simple pleasures of Highland life. He ladled a generous portion of stew into a bowl, inhaling the rich aroma, and settled back into his chair by the stove. Towser stretched luxuriously at his feet, and Hamish took a slow sip of tea, letting the warmth spread through him. The mountains loomed silent and protective, the mist curling faintly around their edges. Loch Dhu had survived its brief disruption, its rhythms restored, and Hamish Macbeth, slow, watchful, and quietly ingenious, had ensured that the village could continue undisturbed, justice quietly served, human folly exposed, and life returned to its unhurried Highland pace. With the fire crackling, the wind sighing outside, and the comforting presence of his faithful dog beside him, Hamish allowed himself the satisfaction of one final thought. In a village like Loch Dhu, it was always better to solve a murder quietly, savour the ordinary, and remain precisely where one belonged, unnoticed, unbothered, and entirely at peace. The world outside could be loud, chaotic, and full of bluster, but here, in this stone-built village nestled against mountains and mist, Hamish Macbeth had found the perfect balance: the subtle power of observation, the quiet triumph of patience, and the gentle pleasure of returning to a pot of stew and the warmth of home. And for Hamish, that was enough. The evening deepened into a long, calm Highland night, the wind whispering over the hills and curling through the chimneys of Loch Dhu. Hamish sat at the kitchen table, Towser stretched at his feet, the remnants of a hearty stew cooling beside him. The village was quiet, the earlier tension of murder and suspicion now dissolved into the gentle rhythms of ordinary life. Blair had departed for Strathbane, chest puffed out and convinced he had orchestrated the investigation, leaving Hamish to enjoy the satisfaction of a job thoroughly done without anyone noticing his true role. Yet, even in the peace, Hamish's mind drifted over the sequence of events, tying together the final threads. The killer, as he had deduced, was someone almost invisible to outsiders, a quiet, polite figure who had relied on the assumption that no one was watching. Their act had been born not of greed or grand malice, but of human pettiness and pride. The victim's persistent questions had touched old grievances, long buried under polite smiles and everyday routines, and the killer had acted in a moment of impulse, confident in the belief that subtlety would shield them. Hamish reflected on the subtle evidence that had guided him: the scrap of fabric snagged on a branch, the discarded glove at the riverbank, the nervous glances and hesitation of the suspect, and the faint traces of perfume and mud. All these minor, almost invisible details had told a story that Blair's volume and assumptions could never uncover. He had watched, waited, and subtly manipulated events until the killer revealed themselves, exonerating the innocent and restoring order to the village. Priscilla Halberton Smythe appeared quietly at the doorway, holding a tray with fresh tea and scones. She offered a small, knowing smile, settling herself across from Hamish. "It seems the village can breathe again," she said softly, "and once more, Blair is none the wiser." Hamish allowed a faint grin. "Aye, Priscilla. Let him enjoy the applause. It suits him. And for the rest of us, life continues, quietly, properly, as it should." Towser shifted, resting his head across Hamish's boots, a gentle weight and constant reassurance. Hamish's eyes drifted to the window, where the faint glow of distant lanterns flickered through the mist. The villagers moved through their routines, carrying on with errands, greetings, and small acts of care that made life in Loch Dhu as resilient as the stone cottages clinging to the mountainsides. Each movement, each glance, spoke more of truth and subtlety than Blair's loud declarations ever could. The killer had been captured, their motive clear, and the red herrings carefully dismantled. Justice had been served not with spectacle or bravado, but with quiet patience, careful observation, and an understanding of human nature that only Hamish possessed. Blair would take the formal credit, and perhaps the village would remember the arrest as dramatic, but Hamish knew the real story, the gentle orchestration, the patient unravelling of subtle lies, and the recognition of human frailty was his alone. Hamish leaned back in his chair, sipping the tea, the warmth spreading slowly through him. Priscilla offered a quiet laugh as Towser snorted softly, curling further into the comfort of the hearth. "It suits you, this quiet triumph," she said. "The world can remain loud and chaotic, but here, you watch, you understand, and you preserve the balance." Hamish allowed a slow nod. "Aye. That's all I ask. To solve the problem, quiet-like, and return to normal. Keep Loch Dhu as it should be, calm, connected, unshaken by bluster or greed." Outside, the wind carried a faint scent of peat and frost, wrapping the village in the familiar Highland air. Hamish allowed himself the rare pleasure of absolute stillness, knowing the crisis was over, the hidden truths revealed, and the village safe once more. The snow-flecked hills, the curling mist, and the dark silhouette of the mountains offered a quiet majesty, as if approving of the subtle justice carried out without fanfare. And as he sipped his final mouthful of tea, listening to Towser's steady breathing and the gentle creak of the old house settling, Hamish thought with rare contentment that this slow, careful, unassuming victory, quietly witnessed by no one but himself, was more than enough. Loch Dhu had survived, the human follies laid bare, and the ordinary rhythms restored. Blair might take the credit, the villagers might whisper about the events in time, but Hamish Macbeth would return to his beloved routines, warm stew, strong tea, and the enduring pleasure of being exactly where he belonged, watching, listening, and knowing the truth. The night deepened, peaceful and still, carrying the soft sigh of wind through the hills. Hamish settled back, Towser at his side, and allowed himself the gentle satisfaction that comes from knowing the quiet observer has, once again, ensured that the Highland village endured safely, cleverly, and justly. Life in Loch Dhu would continue its gentle pace, and Hamish, slow-moving, deceptively idle, and entirely watchful, would continue to guard it in the way only he could, unseen, indispensable, and perfectly content. The case was closed, the village was safe, and Hamish Macbeth, quietly triumphant, allowed the ordinary magic of Loch Dhu to wash over him, certain that this peaceful, subtle victory was exactly the way it should be.